A physical principle from the arsenal of the military and aviation physicists has been conquering medical applications for decades. Explosions with a healing effect are used to treat more and more illnesses.
I hate to praise the war, but it came from the machinery of the Second World War. High speed and water, that can do something.
Kidney stone fragmentation has revolutionized urology and is still hugely important worldwide. But broken bones that can no longer grow together are also successfully healed using shockwaves.
In September, I was finally able to get rid of my crutches. That was wonderful.
Even skin defects and painful tendon attachments regenerate in an astonishing way with these healing explosions.
These 2 minutes are just more bearable than having pain in your foot for 24 hours.
Particularly spectacular and extremely effective, shockwaves have also recently been used on the open heart to combat cardiac insufficiency.
The mechanism that we have discovered does not only apply to the heart, but is the same in all tissues and organs.
Regenerative medicine, heart problems, spinal cord injuries, and even cancer metastases. Where is this medical journey of shockwave technology heading? The hollow muscle in his chest, which works day and night, is far more important to this patient than for most other people. Manfred Kramer has suffered many tragic losses because a heart failed.
This has always been a problem in the family. My father, my sister and my mother all had heart problems. My sister died when she was 22. She went to sleep and never woke up. My father had a bypass operation. He didn't survive it, and my mother was supposed to have a heart valve surgery, but she refused because she didn't want it and died afterwards.
Manfred Kramer also suppressed his increasing heart problems out of sheer fear and suffered at least one heart attack over the years, which he ignored and did not get treated. The resulting cardiac insufficiency turned this vital craftsman and hard worker into a wreck by his own standards.
I had this pain, which was ultimately the heart attack, for a year. A year that I can't describe. I worked with pain. I couldn't walk. I only went for walks with my wife or with my son. I just had anxiety. It was like breathing freezing cold air, and it went on like that for a year. When I exerted myself, I couldn't breathe. But it never occurred to me that I had a problem with my heart. I always said, there is nothing wrong with my heart.
The suppression, the shortness of breath, the fear, all that is in the past for Manfred Kramer. His heart is working as well as it did in his youth, he says, perhaps even better.
I'm the best I've felt in years, even before my heart attack. I've actually been handicapped all these years.
What happened to Manfred Kramer's heart? In spring 2020, he underwent bypass surgery, but that's not all. During the open heart surgery, the man from Carinthia was also treated with a method developed by heart surgeon Johannes Hohlfeld at Innsbruck University Hospital. Shockwave therapy directly on the heart muscle.
At the end of the bypass surgery, while the patient is still connected to the heart-lung machine, the small transducer is moved around the heart and defined diseased areas are treated. Such a study has to be blinded so that there is no placebo effect, which means that nobody knows whether the patient has received the shockwave therapy or not.
When the first results of the study were available, it was stopped prematurely with the approval of the ethics committee. This was because the results were so good that the placebo group could no longer be excluded from the effective real treatment.
We included patients who had a heart pumping capacity of less than 40% and needed bypass surgery. In this group of patients, we saw that the shockwave therapy improved the heart pumping capacity by just over 11 percentage points. 11% may not sound like much, but it has to be said that every 5 percentage point improvement in pumping capacity leads to a significant reduction in the hospital readmission rate for such patients, and also to a significant increase in life expectancy. In other words, the 11 percentage point improvement that we can achieve is a truly spectacular result.
A result that no other method has so far even come close to achieving, especially as the patients in the study had already received all available medication, and the progressive heart insufficiency was basically unstoppable.
Cardiac insufficiency is a huge issue worldwide. Some even speak of an endemic disease. It is estimated that there are around 65 million people worldwide who suffer from it. In Europe, we are talking about 10 million patients. And the number is probably twice as high, including those who are not yet symptomatic. In other words, who don't even know it yet. This means it affects a tremendous number of patients. Cardiovascular diseases are still the #1 cause of death worldwide, ahead of all cancers. So we are dealing with a huge, relevant problem for patients, but also a problem that is socio-economically relevant.
Aber auch ein Problem, das sozioökonomisch relevant ist.
In the United States alone, heart insufficiency is estimated to cost more than $10 billion a year. Until now, there has been no way to revive the parts of the heart muscle damaged by a heart attack.
Es ist ein relativ großes Areal, das chronisch unterversorgt ist.
It is a large area that is chronically undersupplied. The heart muscle cells are still alive, but they do not have sufficient supply of blood, oxygen and nutrients, so that they can participate in the contracting and pumping of the heart. We call it hibernating myocardium, which means heart muscle cells in hibernation, and that describes it quite well. And we can use this method to wake up this part of the heart muscle from hibernation by growing new blood vessels there, and thereby actually regaining relevant areas of the heart.
Und damit gewinnen wir tatsächlich relevante Areale des Herzmuskels zurück.
For treatment during bypass surgery, the team, led by Johannes Holfeld, has developed a globally unique, extremely miniaturized transducer, and also thoroughly researched the effects at cellular level.
Wir wissen, dass es dazu führt.
We know that this leads to connective tissue cells, which we call fibroblasts, and they are present in basically every tissue and organ, being able to access a genetic code that enables them to transform into another type of cell that is currently needed. For example, the heart connective tissue cell transforms into a cardiovascular wall cell, and this is the requirement for new blood vessels to grow. Basically, new blood vessels are formed in all tissues, which improve blood circulation. That's half the job. But, and this has been discovered in recent years, the body's own stem cells are also activated, which implant themselves where the shockwave is applied and grow into the tissue that is needed, which is, of course, regenerative medicine at its best.
The path to this regenerative medicine was an astonishing piece of medical science history and is far from over. At the beginning, as so often with medical advances, there was death and destruction. Shipwrecked sailors swimming near exploding water bombs died in what at first seemed a mysterious way.
Die wurden geborgen und hatten keine äußere Verletzungszeichen und es war relativ.
They were pulled out of the water and had no external signs of injury. At first, it was unclear what had happened to them. The autopsy revealed that lung tissue had been torn.
Suche nach der Ursache und da hat
It turned out that they were all in the water near an exploding water bomb, and that the phenomenon of the shockwave is capable of tearing lung tissue without any external signs of injury. And since then, we have known that mechanical forces are released when different media, like water and air, are involved that conduct sound at different speeds.
Medien, die den Schall unterschiedlich rasch leiten, dass dort mechanische Kräfte frei werden.
Such mechanical forces can be released and used to destroy unwanted components of the human body. In this particular case, ureteral or kidney stones.
Und das sind vor allem die kleineren Steine.
And these are mainly the smaller stones, up to 1.5 centimeters in size, in the kidney and in the uppermost and lowest parts of the ureter, where the shockwave can penetrate all the way to the stone where there is no bone and not so much intestine in between, because the gas there would absorb the shockwave. So it works in the areas where you can find it.
Dieses Gas im Darm würde ja die Stoßwelle abpuffern, nicht?
The smaller, the better, from 3, 4, 5 millimeters up to a centimeter if necessary.
Aber es geht eben auch über 1 Zentimeter zur Not.
Christian Turk is a pioneer of kidney stone fragmentation in Austria and has been successfully treating patients with shockwave technology since the 1980s.
Na, das allererste Gerät war ja riesig.
The very first device was huge. We always said it was the world's most expensive bathtub. The thing cost 22 million shillings in today's purchasing power, probably a similar amount in euros. It was expensive to run to because these spark plugs, which were used to generate the shockwave underwater, were expensive and that were wear parts. This wave is used in a totally different technical way today, but still transmitted into the body through water.
However, the technology, whose biological effects were first discovered in the naval battles of the Second World War, took a highly exciting detour before being used in medicine.
Fact is that until 1955, almost nothing can be found published about the shockwave. Obviously, the military tried to use it as a weapon. However, it turned out that it was not suitable because it could not be conducted over long distances, and so it was released.
And ended up with the physicists instead of the military, more precisely with those of the aircraft manufacturer Dornier, who in the post-war years tried to make one of the world's first supersonic fighter planes all-weather capable.
The Starfighter was a very fast fighter jet at the time in the 1960s. The Federal Republic of Germany bought 916 of them. The speed at which this Starfighter could operate was around 2,700 kilometers per hour. But it could only fly this fast in good weather.
The problem? The shockwaves caused by raindrops at supersonic speed ruined the front edge of the Starfighter's already very small wings.
The Starfighter was more or less almost a missile, which means it also crashed a lot. 265 out of 916 airplanes crashed in Germany. A total of 116 pilots lost their lives, and it crashed like a stone, which is why the wing was particularly important because of the aerodynamics.
The physicists at Dornier therefore constructed an elaborate device to find the cause of the fatal damage to the aircraft wings. An arm rotating at 3 times the speed of sound, on which material samples were hit with water droplets. But how did it become the world's first kidney stone crusher, which stands here in the Dornier Museum in Friedrichshafen, among exhibits from the history of aviation?
Wer genau draufgekommen ist, weiß man nicht mehr, auch die Leute von Dornier nicht mehr. Aber
we no longer know who exactly came up with it, but rumor has it that an employee had a hand in the shockwave area and then very painfully felt that the shockwaves have effects on the body. It then became clear that it would affect biological tissue, and it was physicists who approached the doctors.
Mediziner, die überlegt haben, was kann man damit machen, und auf die Mediziner zugegangen sind.
The Starfighter went down in German military history as an aircraft failure. It was called the Widowmaker, a peg in the ground, or a flying coffin. However, the first medical application of shockwave technology was born during research with water and supersonic speed, namely kidney stone fragmentation or lithotripsy.
Ich lobe ungern den Krieg, aber da kam's aus.
I hate to praise the war, but it came out of the war machinery of the Second World War, where the principle became clear: high speed and water that can do something. And the principle was then turned around, and what came out was the shockwave, which was then implemented for humans. That's why the first few hundred devices, around 400, 500 devices worldwide, came from the company that also produced warplanes in Germany, the Dornier company.
Kidney stone fragmentation revolutionized urological practice in the 1980s.
Before that, kidney stones were wonderful for us young doctors, because every day was an incision surgery, which meant you could really get a routine in incision surgery. But for the patients, it was, of course, extremely stressful. It's a long incision, diagonally across the abdomen, which can cause real problems and discomfort for life.
Today, Christian Turk is the only doctor in private practice in Austria to offer this gentle treatment, using a kidney stone crusher on an ambulatory basis.
A lot of people come because they want a quick treatment without anesthesia, but there are also some people who say, "You know what? I've got so old, do something with me, but only under anesthesia. I don't want to know anything." Then, of course, endourology is better.
It's as if, for example, with these rubber bands, you bring them to tension and release them to hit the same spot again and again. It feels like a tiny explosion, but it is quite bearable.
In countries with highly developed healthcare systems, most kidney stones are now removed using minimal invasive methods. Kidney stone fragmentation is only one of several gentle options. In many parts of the world, however, lithotripsy was and still is indispensable, which is why Christian Turk has repeatedly worked with the Shockwave in Africa as part of humanitarian projects.
Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is an area that belongs to the so-called belt of stone formers around the equator. Every second child that has had an ultrasound scan has been found to have a stone. It's unbelievable. And of course, the shockwave is very helpful there. These are countries where there are hardly any alternatives. For the most part, there are no blood reserves. There is no interventional radiology that can step in an emergency. So the only option is actually incisional surgery, like in the old days. And for children, the shockwave is ideal, because they are able to produce many more fragments. The tissue is more elastic, the kids move more. All this supports stone removal.
Die Steine gehen leichter ab, sie machen mehr Bewegung, all das fördert den Steinabgang.
Stone fragmentation is an enormously helpful, yet destructive medical technique. Nowadays, however, shockwave technology is increasingly conquering the regenerative part of medicine. It no longer destroys tissue, but stimulates it to regenerate. From skin to soft tissue, nerve and heart muscle cells, and even bones. As a young researcher, Gerald Haupt was at the key point of this transition from destruction to regeneration. Even as a student, he encountered kidney stone fragmentation.
The father of a classmate should have a kidney stone fragmentation. He was told it was a new method and that he would be the first patient. We discussed among our friends whether we should expose ourselves to such human experiments, and we advised him against it. He was treated anyways, and the stone was shattered.
As a young medical student, Gerald Haupt also devoted himself scientifically to kidney stone fragmentation. After completing his studies, he was commissioned by the newly founded Medical Technology Division of aircraft maker Dornier to conduct research on the extremely successful Shockwave devices, and not only in America. The aim was to find out what damage or benefit the shockwaves could cause to various body tissues.
Dornier
installed an experimental device in Tucson, Arizona, to find out whether the shockwave could also have effects on various tissues. After the kidney stones burst, it was possible to imagine that many other things in the body could also be affected. The working group then analyzed the tissues that the shockwave passes through on its way to the kidney stone.
Gerald Haupt was the first to notice and document an extremely strong side effect of shockwave technology. He treasures the slides he took of his scientific work back then in the USA. They are a piece of medical history.
We discovered that bone fracture healing can also be significantly improved beyond normal healing. That was a fantastic moment. It was immediately visible to the naked eye that fracture healing and follow-up treatment is significantly better than in the non-treated group.
Parallel to Gerald Haupt in the USA, doctors in the former Eastern Bloc were already exploring the potential of shockwaves for bone healing. Vinzenz Auersperg, an Austrian pioneer of shockwave therapy, learned about this later from a Bulgarian colleague.
What's exciting is that it wouldn't work at all today. They didn't really wrap it up in a big study. They just took soldiers, and the soldiers were told that this was the therapy. Things would be completely different here today. But back then, it was different with communism.
Mit Kommunismus und ähnlichen Situationen halt anders.
Millions of people around the world are now benefiting from these findings and those made by Gerald Haupt during his research in Tucson, Arizona. Andreas Wojtek is one of them. During an evening walk with his dog, he stepped into a foxhole at dusk and suffered a complex fracture to his lower leg, a fracture that would not heal, partly due to a multi-resistant infection. The racing driver and car mechanic, specialized in classic cars, suffered extreme pain for over a year.
Das muss man sich so vorstellen, das ist echt lässig, nicht? Du drehst dich der Fuß nicht.
You have to imagine it like this. You turn around, the foot doesn't. That's bad. I couldn't go on. I had all kinds of conditions. I was in pain, crying, I couldn't walk. I've been with crutches, a wheelchair. Terrible.
Fürchterlich.
Despite all surgical efforts and months of immobilization, Andreas Wojtek's lower leg bone would not heal. Even amputation was considered as a last resort. Through a good friend, the native Viennese learned about the possibility of treatment with high-energy shockwaves at Meidling Trauma Center.
We then provided this focused, high-energy extracorporeal shockwave therapy in May 2022, a one-time procedure. Afterwards, immobilization is still required. A bone needs 3 to 6 months to heal. And then it got better at such a rapid pace that it's hard to imagine when you've suffered as long as I have with this stuff. And then they shoot it with a shockwave, apparently at the right dose, amount, angle, I don't know. Half a year later, I was finally able to get rid of the crutches. That was wonderful.
Das war herrlich.
Without crutches and with a fully healed fracture, Andreas Wojtek can once again drive his favorite classic cars through the countryside around Vienna. The fact that Austria is now a world leader in shockwave treatment of non-healing bone fractures, also known as pseudarthrosis, is mainly thanks to this man's efforts. Wolfgang Schaden is often referred to in the international scientific community as the Shockwave Pope. He came into contact with the first devices used for bone healing shortly after Gerald Haupt's discoveries, immediately recognizing the importance of this technology.
Ich war damals ein junger Unfallchirurg, der sich vor allem mit dem Knochenwachstum, also Knochenheilungsstörungen, beschäftigt hat. Also wenn man sich
At the time, I was a young trauma surgeon who mainly dealt with bone growth and therefore bone healing disorders. So if you imagine now that you've broken a tibia, that means you can't put any weight on it. You need crutches and it hurts when you step on it. In other words, it's a massive cut in a person's life. It was an ideal opportunity to heal bones.
Das Leben eines Menschen. Und das war natürlich eine ideale Möglichkeit, dass man Knochen ausheilen kann.
Shockwave therapy is now routinely used here at the Meidling Trauma Center, for example, often even before bone healing disorders occur, as in the case of this complicated ankle fracture.
Based on our very positive experience, we have now decided not only to treat established pseudoarthrosis, but also to use shockwaves prophylactically for those fractures or artificial stiffening procedures that tend generally to bad healing. This means using focused high-energy shockwave therapy immediately after the surgery.
Shockwave therapy not only ensures that almost hopeless cases, like Andreas Wojtik, can lead a productive life again, it also saves many sufferers from having to undergo surgery.
Wir haben die gleiche Erfolgsrate verglichen zu
We have the same success rate as surgery, with fewer complications, and we save almost 90% of the costs.
Knapp 90% der Kosten.
There is no question that shockwaves must be the therapy of first choice for suitable pseudarthrosis. That's the name given to these non-healing fractures, which is now the view in Austria, but internationally there is still some catching up to do.
Was in Österreich mittlerweile so gesehen wird, aber international ist noch Nachholbedarf.
In addition to success in bone healing, over the years more and more positive effects have been seen in other tissues that were otherwise very difficult to heal. This is why tendons, such as those in the elbow, shoulder area or on the feet, are now also treated with shockwaves.
Es gab ein kleines Gerät zum endoskopischen Zertrümmern von Steinen.
There was a small device for the endoscopic crushing of stones, a kind of pneumatic hammer from a Swiss company. We were the second clinic to have this device. We also made scientific studies of it and then developed how this small device could be turned into a shockwave therapy device for superficial shockwave treatments, and for treatments close to the tendon, the device then spread relatively quickly.
Nahen Behandlungen hat sich das Gerät dann relativ rasch verbreitet.
Since then, tendons such as those on the elbow or feet have also been treated very successfully with shockwaves. Also, shoulder and back treatments proved successful for many patients. Sometimes there are even medals for this.
We went into veterinary medicine, treated racehorses. It was a great success that 5 of these devices were then used in Australia at the Olympic Games, including on a gold medal winner, 4 for humans and 1 for horses.
Shockwaves, a physical phenomenon that has slowly found its way into medicine and into affecting processes in the body via many detours. Only in recent years has science begun to understand the mechanism behind the effect. In what is known as mechanotransduction, mechanical stimuli are converted by the body into cell activity. The 2021 Nobel Prize was awarded for very similar findings in the field of sensory perception.
Das amüsiert mich, dass das mit Physik zu tun hat. An
orthopedic surgeon like me has to deal with physics all the time in his life, because walking upright has to do with physics, and because the cartilage supply has to do with physical forces. And when I put in a prosthesis, It has to withstand some physical things. So I'm learning that every impulse that the body receives has an effect, and the body uses this effect. And we even learned that a shockwave impulse can even have a healing effect. In our daily lives, we are constantly busy giving our bodies impulses. And that is something that is also primordially orthopedic.
Unserem Körper Impulse zu geben. Und das ist etwas, was urorthopädisch auch ist.
Thomas Kastner also had a wide variety of experiences with orthopedic physics. As a heavy smoker, it became harder and harder for him to breathe. So he first had to find a new addiction.
I threw away the cigarettes and just went running day and night. That really became a big addiction.
A very healthy addiction, unlike smoking, but with physical side effects. Thomas Kastner's plantar fascia, the tendon plate on the sole of his foot, became inflamed due to overuse, and at some point it even tore.
Es war ein wahnsinniger brennender Schmerz. Man kann nicht auftreten.
It was an awful, burning pain. You can't put your heel down on the ground, you can't walk for long periods, you can't stand for long periods. It's really unbearable in the heel area because the pain is there 24 hours a day.
Also schaltet sie nie irgendwie ab, dass man mal sagt, jetzt ist kurz aus oder so.
Running training was out of the question, even though Thomas Kastner had a big goal in mind, which was to run the Great Six, the 6 most important marathons in the world, fast enough to reach the finish line. When the plantar fascia tore, he had only completed 2 of the 6 races. It was the explosive physics of shockwave therapy that turned things around.
Beim Einriss
When you get treated, you feel it for a short time, but those 2 minutes are more bearable than to feel the pain in your foot for 24 hours.
After completing the next 2 marathons, a nerve in his heel failed, and an operation with a relatively large wound was unavoidable. The dreams of the running addict from Lower Austria seemed to be shattered. However, because shockwaves can also greatly improve wound healing, the 2 marathons he had missed were soon possible after all.
Die Wunde ist abgeheilt und zusätzlich haben wir einen positiven Effekt.
The wound has healed, and we know from our experimental studies that shockwave therapy can also have a positive effect on the regeneration of peripheral nerves.
Effekt auf die Regeneration von peripheren Nerven haben kann.
Today, Thomas Kastner is one of less than 100 Austrian runners who've successfully completed the Great Six. Parallel to the increasingly differentiated applications of shockwave technology, device technology has also developed further. The world's most expensive bathtub has become a small mobile device, often still working according to the very same principle developed by aircraft manufacturer Dornier.
Was man hier wunderbar beobachten kann, ist, dass in dem Wasser
What you can see wonderfully here is that the shockwave travels through the water and then hits the stone. This is a porous artificial stone that then disintegrates. We can see how the energy of the shockwave affects the stone. But this energy is also required to stimulate bone growth deep in the body, deep in the tissue where the bone is located. That is where the energy must be applied.
Im Gewebe, dort wo der Knochen liegt, muss die Energie ankommen.
Manufacturers have not only been able to drive forward miniaturization, but have also made the devices suitable for numerous different types of treatment. The power parameters of the shockwave can now also be very finely adjusted thanks to different transducers. However, the devices always generate a kind of healing explosion and not just a pressure wave.
The shockwave is produced by an electrical discharge in a fluid. This causes a kind of explosion, and this explosion practically tears the medium with it, while the speed at which this pressure wave then travels is higher than the speed of sound, so supersonic speed. This also causes this very characteristic shape of the shock wave, with a very steep rise to a high pressure wave up to 800 bar, which moves in the direction of the focus and causes these therapeutic effects for the patient.
Because the shockwave had its origins in kidney stone fragmentation, it was long thought that the increasingly evident regenerative effects of this technology were simply related to a kind of microtrauma. According to this theory, the shockwave would cause minor damage to the tissue, which would then stimulate the body to heal. A rather primitive idea, as was later to become apparent, one more closely related to exotic folk medicine than to high-tech applications.
Die Stoßwelle war sehr lange in der Voodoo.
The shockwave was seen as voodoo for a long time, which had to do with the fact that we didn't actually know exactly what we were doing. The scientific community needs models that make it possible to understand what the user is doing, and we simply didn't have them, or had the wrong ones.
This is another reason why shockwave therapy met with a fair amount of skepticism, even from doctors like Carsten Knobloch, who, as a sports physician, had had very good experiences with the technique for tendon treatments. However, as a plastic surgeon and doctor working in aesthetic medicine, he did not believe that shockwaves could also benefit the skin. For example, in the case of cellulite, a phenomenon that causes problems for many women.
Es gab damals schon 2005, 2006 erste Ergebnisse.
Back then, in 2005, 2006, there were already initial results in small studies that suggested that shockwaves could help. I didn't believe it, but I said I would do a randomized control study, so the best possible study design to check whether shockwaves really can help with cellulite, and actually with the assumption that we would only have to examine it carefully enough to see no effect. We publicized it via the press office at the time. Within 2 days we had 500 voluntary patients. We included around 60 women in total, treated them 6 times with shockwave or placebo, and all women also did a little glute strength training over 3 months. The patients were then photographed before and after the treatments, and the pictures were then shown digitally to 2 plastic surgeons who did not know if the pictures were taken before or after. They used a validated scoring system to rate how bad the cellulite was, and it turned out that the shockwave brought 30% improvement, while the exercise alone had 0 effect. In other words, I had to revise my research hypothesis. The shockwave could actually improve cellulite.
Das heißt, auch noch durchgeführt durch eine Doktorandin, die Stoßwelle konnte tatsächlich Zellulite verbessern.
Carsten Knobloch now not only works as a sports physician with shockwaves, but also uses low-dose shockwaves to correct various aesthetic problems. The increasingly wide range of applications for the technology ultimately led to the collapse of traditional dogmas for shockwave expert Wolfgang Schaden.
We then started treating some test patients with chronic wounds and saw that it worked. But of course, that made a mockery of our theory that we were causing damage. That was the point at which I went to the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, with whom we work very closely, and said I needed an explanation. We measure it in different ways and then correlate these results with the biological results in the cell culture experiments. Our aim is to characterize the shockwave at all levels. The results can be published in a first-class scientific manner and then can form the basis for clinical research.
At the same time, the research group led by Johannes Hohlfeld also began studying the effects at cellular level caused by the application of shockwaves to the heart muscle.
Da sind wir draufgekommen hier in Innsbruck, dass
We discovered here in Innsbruck that the mechanical stimulus of the shockwave shears off small bubbles from the cell surfaces. A cell is nothing hard, nothing rigid, but has a liquid membrane. You can imagine it as if you were removing a drop of water from the surface. This bubble releases a receptor of the natural immune system called Toll-like receptor 3 on the neighboring cell, giving it the signal that is required to set all the regenerative effects in motion. These push, pull and shear forces activate genes in the cell nucleus. They suddenly start to become active due to this motivation and produce proteins. Surprisingly, these are the very proteins we need in pathology.
The results of basic research also indicate that the shockwave may even activate a kind of natural stem cell therapy, which means that the body itself becomes active.
Ganz offensichtlich, und das war sehr schwierig, das nachzuweisen.
Quite obviously, and this was very difficult to prove, messenger substances are also produced, which then reach the bone marrow via the bloodstream and activate stem cells, progenitor cells, precursor cells, which reach the bloodstream where the shockwave was applied, settle there, and become the tissue that is needed.
Dort ein und differenzieren zu dem Gewebe, das gebraucht wird.
What's interesting is that the mechanism of action that we have discovered, that is to stimulate regeneration via this immune receptor, is not tissue-specific. So it doesn't just apply to the heart, but is the same in all tissues and all organs. This explains why shockwave therapy can be used for many indications in different parts of the body.
Diese Zellorganellen, die wir zum Heilen brauchen, die werden aktiviert.
These cell organelles that we need for healing are activated and can provoke this in any cell, whether it's a bone cell or a fibrocyte or a tendocyte. It doesn't matter. And you have to learn to understand this somehow. And the basic researchers have helped us a lot in this respect.
Begreifen lernen, und da haben die Grundlagenforscher uns viel geholfen, das muss man sagen.
These autonomic processes in the body would also explain why shockwave therapy practically never causes side effects, apart from rare bruising.
Wir kennen die Schmerzen bei der Applikation.
We are familiar with the pain caused by the application of very high energies, but no significant changes or side effects are known. And we must not forget that over 6 million kidney stone fragmentations have been documented and observed over a long period of time in America, and no cellular changes have been observed there either. Even no tendency to tumor formation, and that of course made it easier for us to develop such a technology quickly, because we could always refer to much higher energies being used, namely in kidney stone fragmentation, without any significant side effects being observed.
Ohne dass wesentliche Nebenwirkungen beobachtet wurden.
As the positive effects of shockwaves on nerve tissue have become increasingly apparent, the first experimental applications on the brain are now also being tested. Helmut Plattner, for example, suffered a particularly severe stroke around 15 years ago, which he only just survived.
I then said, if the Father in heaven needs you more than I do, then go. You know I can manage. But I would still like to keep you. And I was allowed to keep him. It has now been 14 years, and he's still here.
The Plattners are an impressive couple, an example of unbreakable love, together for about 60 years, married for almost as long, and still happy. Even the communication difficulties caused by the stroke have not changed this.
Am Anfang habe ich immer noch geglaubt, na ja, vielleicht ist nur die Sprache.
At the beginning, I still thought maybe it's just the speaking. So I took the computer with me to the hospital and thought maybe he could write if he couldn't talk. But nothing worked. He has a very short concentration span. He can read words now, but after 3 words, he no longer knows what he's reading. And that is the most severe form of aphasia, because then everything is gone.
Und das ist die schwerste Form der Aphasie, weil dann alles weg ist.
Nevertheless, the Plattners take every opportunity to improve communication, at least a little. For example, with special speech therapy training that works with children's songs that are stored very deep in the brain. In addition, Helmut Plattner will soon be taking part in a study in which the brain is stimulated with shockwaves immediately after speech therapy, using real-time navigation. This is a particularly complex area of research, and not just for shockwaves.
The brain is extremely sensitive, and pathological changes in the brain are also extremely sensitive changes. The biggest problem is always uncontrolled bleeding, which is why brain surgeries are so difficult. These are special challenges. The brain is also the least understood human organ. There is an enormous need for neuroscientific research here. This is of course also the case for our new method, which is why we are doing intensive research on how we can optimize the procedure and how we can expand the range of applications. The brain is sensitive, so it's dangerous, and the neurological diseases are very diverse.
In Vienna, however, research is not only focusing on the possible effects of shockwaves on the brain, but also on the nerve tissue in the spinal cord. Shockwave technology should help to lessen or perhaps even prevent paraplegia after spinal cord injuries.
Wir wissen, dass die Stoßwelle einen entzündungsmodulierenden Effekt hat. Das heißt, wir wissen, wir brauchen Entzündung.
We now know that the shockwave has an inflammation-modulating effect. Without inflammation, there can be no healing. That is always at the beginning. The problem with nerve tissue in particular is that this inflammatory process lasts for 10 to 14 days and the damage increases. So the initial damage immediately after the trauma is, for example, 10% of the spinal cord, and after 14 days it's 30 to 40%. In order to stop precisely this inflammation at an early stage, high doses of cortisone were administered for a long time, but this led to so many further complications that this is only done very rarely today. So the shockwave can keep the damage to a minimum and also supports early regeneration, so the recovery is faster.
Die frühzeitige Regeneration, sodass es zum Ausblasen von Nervenfasern kommt und sozusagen zu einem rascheren Erholen.
However, the treatment must take place within 48 hours of the injury, basically on freshly admitted accident victims, which makes this kind of study extremely difficult.
Es läuft derzeit in Österreich eine
A multi-center prospective study is currently in progress in Austria, which is also placebo-controlled for fresh spinal cord injuries. It is extremely difficult. A patient is admitted to the trauma room after a spinal injury and is asked to sign a 16-page consent form. He is supposed to take note of it knowingly, of course. The study is in progress. We have already included 20 patients, but we would need over 80 patients for the first interim analysis. And the main problem at the moment is recruiting patients.
Aber für die erste Interimsanalyse würden wir über 80 Patienten benötigen. Und derzeit ist das Hauptproblem die Rekrutierung der Patienten.
In recent years, in addition to stone fragmentation, the shockwave is finding another area of application in urology, and that is the treatment of erectile dysfunction.
Dass man durch die Stoßwelle
The shockwave induces better blood circulation, which then leads to an increase in potency, not during the treatment, but when it's desired.
Wir machen das hier in der Praxis auch regelmäßig jede Woche.
For at least some of the men affected, shockwave treatment for erectile dysfunction works very well, often even permanently.
Patients need to know that the success rate is between 50 and 60%, but the alternative is permanent medication or an injection into the penis before each intercourse, or even the surgical implantation of a penile prosthesis. So a 50% chance is one that you should take advantage of.
In many areas, the success rate of shockwave therapy is quite impressive. However, with practically all applications, there is also a rate of non-responders. In other words, patients who do not respond to the treatment at all.
I have no reliable idea about this. I could imagine that it is not the non-responder, but a wrong therapy, that you could be successful with a different program in the dosage, in frequency, and in the intervals between treatments. But I have no evidence for this. We really tried to correlate age, concomitant diseases, smokers, non-smokers, all sorts of things, and found no reasonable correlations. The only thing that was significant was scaphoid fractures, which are carpal bones. They healed significantly better in self-employed than in non-self-employed people. But that is a random finding.
Where can shockwave therapy be taken in the future, after being used to destroy stones in the body, and then increasingly for the regeneration and healing of tissues? The use on the heart is a huge step forward, but can this technology perhaps also be used to fight the second most common cause of death worldwide, tumors? This man's research has found evidence of this. Eric Toyer is a mathematician and physicist who worked for a long time in the USA, making nuclear power plants safer, for example against aircraft crashes, using his calculation models.
And then my brother was diagnosed with cancer, and the prognosis was so bad that I said, no, we're not going to give up now. And then I started to use these calculation methods to analyze cancer cells. After long nights, it seemed to me that I found an approach. So I took living cancer cells and treated them with these shockwaves. They died. That's how it started.
However, the idea of treating cancer using shockwaves is aimed less at destroying cancerous tumors and more at unmasking metastases. As a result, the body's immune system, together with modern cancer drugs, can fight the tumor more effectively. This is the hope of the doctors who started an initial study on this at the Charité Clinic in Berlin at the end of 2023.
Erstaunlicherweise sind Krebszellen weicher als normale Zellen. Sie haben ein zerstörtes Zytoskeleton.
Surprisingly, cancer cells are softer than normal cells. This means that if we apply the right shockwaves, we can selectively destroy the cancer cell. The idea is that we treat easily accessible metastases and break up tumor cells there. This exposes the cancer cell. That means it releases tumor antigens, and these tumor antigens are then used for the tumor-toxic programming of the T cells, which are the immune cells. These T cells then search the entire body for precisely these metastasis cells.
Programmierung der T-Zellen, also der Immunzellen, benutzt. Und dann suchen diese T-Zellen im ganzen Körper genau diese Metastasenzellen.
Following a pilot study in the laboratory, Eric Toyer has already treated a number of patients with astonishing success, including one particularly difficult case.
Man hat ja vor mehr als 12 Jahren ein Melanom.
She had a malignant melanoma, removed more than 12 years ago. But at that time, she already had liver and lung metastases and an abundance of superficial skin metastases. They tried everything, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery, but it was all of little use, so she was given immunotherapy. These are checkpoint inhibitors that work well with melanoma, but not always. So then we also applied shockwaves and were delighted to see that the one metastasis we treated had disappeared after 4 treatments. And then we were amazed to see that all the other skin metastases had disappeared, and the liver metastasis too. This was a so-called abscopal effect. That means that we treat one area and have the effects throughout the whole body.
Das heißt, wir behandeln eine Stelle und haben die Effekte im ganzen Körper.
Shockwave therapy has brought medical success in many different areas in recent decades, even if truly reliable scientific data is still lacking for many applications.
Es waren ja viele an diesem Weg beteiligt.
There were many people involved in this process who then decided not to continue, because the path was extremely long, rocky and filled with many obstacles and problems. It has now taken us a total of around 15 years to really get from the first trials to clinical application. In the meantime, we've managed to get a lot of other people excited about it, and we're now a huge team working on it. We've also won a lot of science awards, and we are slowly gaining international recognition for it. So my personal summary is, my life might have been a bit easier if I hadn't got stuck with the Shockwave, but it would also have been less exciting, and we would have missed the chance to make a really big, relevant contribution to medicine.
Wirklich großen, relevanten Beitrag für die Medizin zu leisten.
Many more patients, like Manfred Kramer, will benefit from this in the future. He is no longer suffering from heart insufficiency.
The alarm clock rings at 2:45. I get up and I start to work at 4 o'clock. At the beginning, I was offered 50% work and 50% rehabilitation allowance. But of course, I didn't take that offer because I just felt better and better and simply wanted to work. I'm fully involved in life, and that's how I like it.
By the way, due to the coronavirus, Manfred Kramer was not able to complete a rehabilitation stay after his surgery. A multiple bypass and shockwave therapy had to be enough.